Hi, I'm Jonathan Keel, founder and CEO of Sixth Street. I have about 20 years of e-commerce and enterprise software development experience. And I started my Salesforce journey back actually at the founding company of Cloud Craze.
And good afternoon or evening or morning, wherever you are. I'm John Esposito. I'm a technical architect at Sixth Street. I have been working on Cloud Craze and then B2B commerce projects for about 4 years in verticals like manufacturing, retail, high-tech, and consumer packaged goods. I have a background in empirical software engineering research, and I'm the kind of architect who still writes code, so don't be scared if some of that comes up.
Excellent. Well, in today's session, we're going to be talking about B2B commerce development versus standard Salesforce development. If you've ever needed to develop on the Salesforce B2B commerce platform before, today you've come to the right place. Here's a familiar scenario that you may have experienced. You're starting to work on your first Salesforce B2B commerce storefront, and you've written plenty of like Apex, Visualforce, maybe even some Lightning or Lightning components as well. But you go into your first storefront, you start inspecting using your favorite browsers debugging tools, Chrome obviously for most of us, I think. And you look at it and you're like, whoa, what the heck is this? Well, now you're faced with an unfamiliar set of frameworks that you've typically not seen in Salesforce development. So today we're going to discuss some of this. We're going to talk about how the Salesforce B2B commerce front end is not like standard Salesforce development, the client-side stack of Salesforce development. We're also going to talk about the server-side application layers of B2B commerce, which is a little different. And also we're going to dive deeper into its super normalized data model as well. So
we'll go through each of these, spend just a few minutes on each of them. There'll be additional resources in the description to tutorials on the relevant concepts, and also to, we have some more materials to go into more depth. All right, so first of all, item number one that might puzzle you if you're inspecting your browser when you open a B2B commerce storefront as a developer is that you'll see that there's, and if you start looking at code in the managed package, looking at, for example, Visualforce pages that embed Visualforce components, trying to figure out how these pages are built, the home page, the product detail page, the product list page, the cart page, all of that, you'll realize that the Visualforce that's visible to you is not going to tell you very much. In fact, these pages are not primarily built as Visualforce pages. They are Visualforce, but Visualforce is mostly a way to stitch together chunks of code at a very high level. The actual construction of each page, and each page more or less functions like a kind of a spa, kind of a single page application with more or less complexity depending on the page you're on. But the actual work, the meat, the substantial sections of the page are not in Visualforce. They're not in Aura. They're not in Lightning Web Components. They're in a JavaScript framework, which is nowadays kind of old, but was one of the early JavaScript frameworks that tried to do a good job of maintaining state on the page and between the server and the client. So that's Backbone. So the actual basic building blocks of the front-end client-side stack in B2B commerce are Backbone.js. Now, if you look at recent surveys over the last like 3 or 4 years on the use of JavaScript frameworks, Backbone is not very high. So Backbone is not super likely to be familiar to you if you have just started JavaScript development. It also was created in this sort of slightly awkward time in the history of JavaScript frameworks when we were already trying to componentize things. And so this is the concept of the Backbone view. And Backbone has subviews and all that. We were already pretty good at templating, and the templating engine that's used by Backbone and the B2B commerce framework is Handlebars, a variation of the mustache style of templates. But we didn't have the shadow DOM yet, and so there wasn't really isolation among the different components. So you open up your browser, you start looking at how the page works, you might start feeling A, this is unfamiliar, and B, this is a lot of spaghetti. And it's true, the B2B commerce front-end framework does not require you to not write spaghetti. And in fact, the ways that you are, the most powerful ways of the various ways to customize the front end could easily turn into spaghetti and depend actually on having a single DOM that you can manipulate. So it's up to you to be disciplined about not doing that. that means you just have to keep the problems in your head rather than leaving them to the framework. So because we use Backbone in B2B commerce, classic, and handlebars templating on top of Backbone, you're not, if you're just a Salesforce developer, familiar with Visualforce, maybe even with Aura or Lightning Web Components, that will not look super familiar. If you're a pure JavaScript developer, if you're somebody who's coming from the recent, like again, post-Shadow DOM world with a framework like Angular or React or something like that, it may look kind of more like a big mess. The one framework that's a little bit closer to Backbone in my estimation, the modern framework, is Vue. It's a little bit more like Backbone, so I think it'll be a little bit less unfamiliar if you're using Vue. But Backbone actually is, the way that it's set up in B2B commerce is quite a bit, potentially quite a bit more complex than that, depending on the page. So that's number one. The stack is very different. And so I actually, when I came to B2B commerce, I didn't have as much Salesforce, like Visualforce experience as I had just general sort of web application development experience. So for me, this actually looked kind of familiar because my web application development experience was a little bit older anyway. It was not super cool and modern and Angular-y. This was about 4 years ago, like I said. But Jonathan actually comes from an interesting perspective here because I guess he has both the web application / full server to client, full stack Java to JavaScript, and also the Salesforce specific development experience. He was in that mindset when he first saw B2B commerce front end, I think. So maybe you can talk about that actual experience of seeing this weird new thing when you did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely was new and different. I mean, so yes, my background a lot came from J2E architecture and really having separation of concerns. Working with MVC models and then when I flipped over then to Salesforce, just straight Salesforce, working with Visualforce and Apex, and then there's a few other things on top of that because we did like some public sites. Using like force.com platform, and so Salesforce land was a little easier. Somebody referred to Apex as like being like Java on train wheels a little bit, and certainly there was a lot sort of missing in the beginning. Then once getting used to how to develop in Salesforce, which is kind of models a little bit off of Java server faces, and then also just normal J2E architecture, but just not to the same extent. I would say then once you started working in Cloud Craze, it was a lot different. I mean, I'm used to working on different frameworks. jQuery was one. So when you get to start, you start seeing these front-end frameworks in motion and having them work with Salesforce, it was quite different. To me, as a Salesforce developer trying to come over across to this different way of thinking, you sort of had to almost leave a little bit of what you learned about Salesforce behind, and then I would say and really focus on the front-end development. But whatever you do, and I tell people this all the time, like new consultants in this space, don't do what a lot of them do, which is, oh, well, I'm not comfortable with handlebars, and I'm not comfortable with backbones, so I'm going to just use what I know, which is like jQuery, and develop my own sort of quasi system within all that to like make call outs to some remote calls to Apex and everything else. And while you can do that, it gets really messy really fast. Like John, to your point, if you have a spa, there's certain things that happen in certain orders, there's listeners. So definitely don't do that. But anyway, it took a while, I'll admit. I started off doing the whole, like, I'll just throw jQuery around, but you quickly will find out that that's going to just cause you more headaches later.
Yeah, and I guess that example of sort of pendulum swinging between extremes, between the sort of structured approach that you're familiar with as a Salesforce front-end developer, and well, I have jQuery access to the whole DOM, so I might as well just do everything directly. That is going to be maybe easy short term, but long term it often is going to be dangerous. And of course, there are situations where doing a short-term fix makes sense. Like honestly, sometimes I today will say, look, there's one little thing I have to change. The correct way to do it would be to basically paste a whole bunch of code and vary it slightly to replace the template that comes out of the box. But if it's just one little thing, maybe I can actually just directly manipulate that with jQuery. That's a dangerous decision to make, but of course there are always going to be trade-offs. It's probably going to be the first thing you want to do when you first start working on pages. But the reason why that's a bad idea for B2B commerce front end is that, again, so the page is not actually like different modules are not separated from each other in some sort of like rigid, rigorous way, like in a shadow DOM. But the different components, like let's say the little cart widget that appears on the left or on the right, depending on what page you're on, or the like edge to cart component, or the compare products component that appears when you check a couple of products and start comparing them on the product list page, those do communicate with each other using events. They also communicate using a specific event name structure, and that event name structure is actually built into the CloudCraze code. So what happens is each chunk of code on the CloudCraze front end is basically a variation. It's an extension of a backbone view. There's a special CloudCraze view, which is an extension by the _JS extend to extend a backbone view. And one of the things that happens after every render in a post-render function that's called after every render in the CloudCraze view is an event is broadcast. It's called like view : event name : refresh. And that is the thing that you really should be thinking about when you're trying to understand communication among different components. It's a wrapper, an event that's also wrapped in a CloudCraze pub/sub utility that you can listen to and that you can then use to know exactly what renders when, to understand how the events propagate around the SPA. So events actually are basically just thrown into the DOM and you can listen to them at any point. You don't have to worry about what the bubbling structure is, which can be, again, easy, but also can be dangerous. We do have a talk on this that we'll link to in the description. We get into some more detail about that. So the key here is that there's a lot more structure than with jQuery, a lot less structure than with Aura or Lightning Web Components. And you have to figure out what the important structure is. The important structure is dependent on the domain. That is to say, on how commerce works, how a SPA that is about adding stuff to the cart and browsing and looking at specifications and stuff works. So just a quick question, Jonathan, before we move on. Do you happen to remember, so I can answer this too, but what was the most or the biggest hurdle to overcome when moving from being doing front-end Salesforce work to doing front-end B2B commerce work? I can tell you one thing, if you want to think about it for a second.
Well, I can. Well, you can go ahead. I'll let you go first.
So
I want to see if
me,
it's the same as mine.
all right, good, yeah. So for me, this is not actually primarily a technical thing. This was the idea of extending a UI by basically copy pasting an existing template and then modifying it. So the way this works in B2B commerce is, and this is how Salesforce actually specifically recommends you do deep customizations of the front end if you have to, is that out of the box, every element on each page SPA is its own handlebars template, or every section of every component is its own handlebars template. There's a lot of logic built into those templates, a lot of logic that decides what should show based not only on the state of the data, but also on configuration settings. There are hundreds of configuration settings that users can input in the CloudCraze admin or the CC admin. So because there's so much emphasis on declarative customization, there's an awful lot of code that you would definitely not think of because you have no interest in all those customizations when you're just trying to design a page for a specific mockup or for a specific user flow. In order to prevent you from missing all of that and making the declarative work just useless in the admin settings, Salesforce says you should just go ahead and paste this whole big template and then start modifying it from there. And because those templates are often in Visualforce components inside Visualforce pages, which means you can't, because they're in components, you can't see the component contents in the managed package. The only way for you to actually start work modifying the front end in a deep code focused way of many pages is to view the source, view the page source, not the rendered source, but view the actual source as it comes from the Salesforce server. Find the correct template, copy paste that, and start modifying that once you've injected it. That seems really weird and counterintuitive. It sounds like something you do if you were hacking into it rather than doing it, not customizing it in the sort of the proper way. But that is the way that, the only way really to do it, and takes advantage of the fact that you've got a single global DOM that you can just start overriding it however you like. That's my weirdest thing for when I first started B2B commerce. Well, go ahead though. How about yours?
Well, it's very similar to what I was going to say. I will say it was a little weird to copy and paste these different templates. For me, I think because I started working on the platform back before it was even acquired by Salesforce. I came from the founding company of CloudCraze before it was even a separate company. And back then, we had these templates, but a lot of the data came out of this massive CCRZ JavaScript object. And back then, there wasn't really a lot of documentation. It was something that was created by the product team, and then you were sort of expected to kind of go through and find the data you needed. So you would go through like, I need this data, I don't see it, you know, in some of these out of the box templates. Oh, maybe it's in this giant CCRZ, you know, JavaScript object. So you'd fumble through. You'd find something that looked like the data you needed, and you'd use it, and then you come to find like that wasn't the right version. Maybe it helped for the particular instance or page you run, but then later the data just disappeared. So those are a lot of my the trials I had. But you know, going forward, when they did, you know, get acquired by Salesforce, and Salesforce has done a really great job of providing lots of documentation and really helping people to know how to appropriately extend the platform. I would think, yeah, back to what you were saying, John, I think it is weird to just think, oh, I'm just going to take this code, I'm going to copy it, I'm going to paste it, and then I'm going to tweak it. Versus, I don't know, it's like normal. Again, I was used to like, you know, J2E development, and you can do sort of this IntelliSense, right, where you're going to an object and you see all the fields you can use, and you can just use them, and it's a little different in this these frameworks and platform.
Yeah, it's a little bit like flying blind, but you're trusting the template that's there, and then you can help by exploring the CCRZ object a little bit, but then you have to know where you're looking in there, and that's a very large global object whose contents vary by page, and it's not completely obvious how they do unless you looked at the extended documentation, for example. So yeah,
a lot of runtime trust, instead of me trusting more of the compile time type coding, you know, on the back end, for example.
Yep. So you end up doing sometimes doing things like check to see if this attribute exists, and then check to see if the child exists, and then check to see if the child exists, because you're afraid of hitting some sort of null. Like, so it'll be like CCRZ double pipe, CCRZ dot whatever, double pipe, CCRZ dot whatever double pipe, until you construct a large line that's making sure you don't get any nulls, just because you aren't quite sure at what point the CCRZ object on which page is going to be populated. Yeah, that's a good one.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm sure people listening, if they've started down this path, they're finding themselves in that similar situation.
Yeah, they're like, yeah, what is that object? Yeah, it's everything for the whole front-end framework. All right, good. So let's move on. And actually, one of the things you mentioned is relevant to weird thing number 2 from the point of view of a Salesforce developer, which is actually much less weird from the point of view of a J2E developer, which is that the server-side architecture of B2B commerce, and particularly the architecture as makes available to you as a developer who's extending it, makes available to you various options for writing custom Apex code that's run within the B2B commerce backend framework, is made using a layered application architecture. This is something that's common in enterprise Java applications or C# applications, for example. You'll see it in some larger Salesforce applications, more likely to be AppExchange applications. But if you're just implementing Salesforce here and there, it's less likely that you'll have run into this pattern. And it makes perfect logical sense. It's not actually, like, I think, conceptually difficult, but it might be surprising. And this layering we're talking about is that, so we've got basically there's a presentation layer, right? And that's going to be, actually, in the case of B2B commerce, split. You have a controller, right? An Apex controller that sends data to a page. The page then has the page then renders that data via backbone view into a handlebars template and all of that. The initial page load that occurs usually has not that much data in it, because these are Ajax-y modern JavaScript applications. Most of the data comes via remote Apex, Visual Force remoting. And that means that if you're only customizing the front end, you've basically got like some data that you can then treat as having a sort of a data layer and a presentation layer in the client. But there's also, separately from the split presentation layer, there is a distinction, and it's a distinction that you can interact with between the business logic layer and the persistence layer, let's say, in B2B commerce. This is how the application is built, and this is how you can extend it. So, for example, if you're going to start working on expanding the functionality of, let's say, the cart page, one thing you want to do is, or I should say, of add to cart, one thing you might want to do is add special rules that prohibit add to cart based on some custom things that you worry about. Or you might also want to show special fields on the cart when somebody goes to the cart page that are not out of the box. You might think, and this is the first thing you'd be tempted to do, would be, oh, well, I'll let the page load, and then I'll just do another Ajax call out to get those additional fields for the cart items that are on the page. Or you might say, if you have to modify the item when it's added to the cart, well, I'll let the add to cart happen as in the standard way, but then I'll put a trigger or a workflow or something like that on the cart item, and then I'm going to modify the contents after the fact. Well, you can do that, that'll work, but that splits up the logic into places that are not sensible, that really shouldn't be occurring. Like it shouldn't be the case that a cart page loads in state X and then you change something that's fundamental to the cart just to show to the user differently. It also shouldn't be the case that a cart item is added in a certain way and then you change something that's fundamental to the way the cart item is added after that happens. And so to prevent you from sort of like hacking your way in these epicycles, you do have access in the B2B commerce backend framework to many service hook points. Basically, they call it the data layer, the data service layer. You can extend using Apex code the way that cart items are fetched, the way that products are fetched, the way that priceless items are fetched. All of that logic at multiple stages of the construction of what happens to be a dynamic SQL query in the backend. So that's at your like persistence layer logic. And then on top of that, you also have there's dozens of these, and not all of them are actually fully documented, but that keeps getting better day by day. You have also a business logic layer, which you can also plug into with Apex. And that would be something like a specific area of domain functionality, like add to cart has its own logic, or get active cart has its own logic, or register a new user has its own logic, or get the cart active account. All of those have different logic classes, and all of those logic classes are virtual classes in the managed package, which you can then extend. They each have a number of methods. The number of methods varies by the domain, obviously. So you do have a data persistence layer with data access services, and you have a logic layer, business logic layer on top of that, and you can modify that with pretty much any Apex you want. That's, for me, again, was not familiar from general Salesforce development when all you're doing is like customizations here and there. It's more like something I'm familiar with from we're building an actual thing, like an object, a construction, an artifact that is an enterprise application that has to have these layer separations because we need to be able to, be able to plug in parts here and there and expand it arbitrarily in 20 years or whatever. So maybe Jonathan, could you talk about like did it feel weird to you coming to B2B commerce, or was that actually like, hey, this is like my J2E stuff. This is actually more familiar to me than the backbone front end stuff that was odd.
Yeah, so I think it was a little bit more familiar. Again, coming from the J2E world, there's a lot that was done on the server side, and back then it was sort of thought of as like, oh, only use JavaScript for validation. Like, don't let too much logic be in that layer, right? So this whole idea of the single page application or SPAs, right, we've been talking about, was a little bit new to me, that aspect, right? But the having different layers was definitely a little bit of a breath of fresh air for me, because going from what I was used to, then coming to Salesforce and everything was just like, well, you got Visualforce, you have Apex, and it's kind of, I sort of missed a lot of the, a lot of, I mean, you can do architecture in Salesforce, especially now you can do it a lot more. Back, whatever it was, 10 years ago, it just seemed like it was a little bit limiting. So I kind of got out of practice, if that makes sense. Like a lot of patterns I had, memorized and used, and I was like, had the Dingo 4 books and everything, and all that type of stuff. And then you get into Salesforce land, and then you sort of have to sort of forget a little bit of that, or you try to implement it, but it doesn't quite work. So anyway, long story short, yeah, it was sort of nice to sort of have everything restacked to a point where there's different layers. So again, for me, the struggle was a little bit more on the SPA side of things, right? The single page application and how that normally worked. It was a little new for me from my background.
Right, yeah, and my experience working with various developers who work in B2B commerce is that if they are Java or C# developers who have done enterprise application development before, the server-side extension points in B2B commerce actually look pretty familiar to them. They understand the idea of decomposing into a business logic divided up by domain and into data access objects divided up by, roughly speaking, by the object relational mapping, which is going to be a pretty small set of objects for each area of B2B commerce, but is a large set of objects overall, because commerce covers a lot. One thing I'll just note about the server-side extensions is that it is nice to have access to the structure of an application that you're extending compile time, obviously. That's a generally really nice thing. But in the case of B2B commerce, you don't have all that much access to it because the data that gets passed around these different layers is always in a format that's very amenable to consumption by JavaScript applications, and also to extension in the future. That is, rather than committing to a specific structured object to pass around among the different abstract classes and or virtual classes and your specific implementations of them, B2B commerce on the server side just passes around a map from a string to an object that really can nicely turn into a JSON object, obviously. The everything is an object approach of JavaScript means that everything is kind of just a map string object in Salesforce, in B2B Commerce in the backend. And that's useful, but it does mean that you can't just by like reading method signatures get any idea of what something is doing. You have to look at the documentation, or you have to print out a whole bunch of what comes in and out of all of these different methods that you're overriding. And that can be a little bit tedious because those different methods get overridden in different, or get called, I should say, in different Apex transactions. Remember, this is a SPA. So we have one page load, and then every single AJAX is going to be a different Apex transaction. So it gets a different log in the Salesforce logs. However, here's where a cool feature of the B2B Commerce framework comes in. B2B Commerce will actually wrap all of the different logs up that are called within a single transaction and throw them into your browser console so that you can just treat your browser console as a single huge log for the entire page load, including all subsequent to initial loads AJAX calls. So this is the CC log feature. This is something if you've started Salesforce B2B Commerce development, you're probably using it all the time. If you haven't yet, you absolutely must do that. There are cases where you need to look at the Apex logs, but you should really get to know the CC log feature because it combines all the different server-side logging that you want, and that actually comes in the managed package as well in one filterable in your browser console view. Gets around that map string object difficulty a little bit.
Might be a good idea to have a session on that sometime.
Yeah, debugging B2B Commerce.
Debugging B2B Commerce. I know a lot of people struggle. We should probably have to talk on that.
That's a good point. Yeah. That would be a good one. Very useful. You can, yeah. All right, good. CC log, but then also when you have to use other things. All right, good. So let's move on actually. So from the server-side layers, and we touched a little bit on this in the last discussion. So in this layered model, we're going down from the presentation layer to the business logic to the data access layer or the persistence layer. But another thing that may be a little bit intimidating when you first come to B2B Commerce as a developer is how normalized the data model is. That is to say, B2B Commerce fully embraces having a whole lot of different custom objects or a whole lot of different tables. From a database design point of view, I think they tried as close as possible to stick to third normal form in the COD schema, meaning that there aren't really situations where something which is in reality its own entity is sort of fudged in a specific field. There's only one exception I can think of in the B2B Commerce model, that is pricing tiers. The way that B2B Commerce stores pricing tiers, where a certain range of products gets one price, another range becomes price. That sort of, from a pure data modeling perspective, should be in its own table or in its own object, but it is stored as a single JSON object on the CC price list item. And the reason for that, I think, is actually just because of the depth limits of SOQL queries. So it's a technical limitation of the Salesforce platform. Otherwise, I think they really, really try to normalize as much as possible. But that means that you've got over 100 different objects, custom objects, in the B2B Commerce managed package. And that's a lot, especially when it's not always completely obvious when you first glance at it, which of these are junction objects and which of these are like solid, substantial kind of objects, actual domain objects. That's something that, again, might be more familiar to you from certain backgrounds, but my experience in Salesforce is that as applications grow, people will not want to commit to a whole new object often. They'll say like, yeah, we can just add a field, and oh, we can add another field here, and because it's so easy to add new fields, there's no like major database schema changes involved when you add a new field. People will sometimes maybe over rely on adding fields and therefore not think as deeply about the domain model and therefore not produce as many custom objects as B2B Commerce does. I don't know, what do you think, Jonathan, about that?
No, I definitely think that's true. I mean, I think in the Salesforce community, there's a couple of mindsets that I've seen. The primary one I see a lot is that like it's primarily driven by, hey, the ease of use of adding fields and objects. So a lot of times people just, we need this data at a field, even though the data may exist somewhere else. Like it's not over architected. Let's just add what we need, and then this is the reason actually there's app exchange apps out there that are used for data cleanup, like metadata cleanup, right? I think there's I'm trying to remember the name of it right now, but there's a major one out there that's used for seeing which fields are used, which ones are not, and so it's, I don't want to call it a problem because there's always a need for doing something like that and not over architecting. But again, since my background was in J2E, it is a little bit easier for me to swallow the pill of, yes, like third normal form and having everything sort of separated. I mean, I came in from a background when I first started e-commerce. I was on actually another founding team, the founding team of Walmart.com, and when I was there, we had a data architect, and you were not allowed to add any tables or fields unless it went through this data architect, reviewed everything, who not only made sure that the database not only had, there wasn't any duplication, but if there was data that existed in another database, you couldn't also create that. They went into the extra extreme, if that made sense. I mean, there's some cases where it was okay because for speed and whatever else, you don't want to make another call, but sometimes, they would say, oh no, only one database should have this data. You shouldn't have it duplicated because now you have two databases with multiple out of sync data and everything else. So that's another extreme. But yeah, so I think it's definitely a different way of thinking. But that does make it the power of the platform is that you can add stuff as you need. And to me, it's all about getting things in users' hands, into the hands of the business sooner rather than later. And so that's what makes it powerful.
Yeah, and because Salesforce applications, for the reason you're talking about, often do grow organically without having to go through huge reviews by a data architect. If you're coming into B2B commerce as a standard Salesforce developer, seeing over 100 custom objects might seem to you like over-architecting at first. And it is true, of course, for performance reasons that as the later versions of B2B commerce came out, they did the developers did add some denormalized tables for performance reasons, some flattened index tables, which again is kind of what you were talking about, Jonathan. Even if you wanted to have a perfect data model, sometimes you're going to need to flatten stuff for the sake of performance or duplicate stuff for the sake of performance. And they do that again increasingly over time. I actually don't know, but I'm assuming that's partly because more customers started just having more records, more products, more customers, or more price list items, and they realized too many joins are actually going to cause, at that scale, and that's a good way of thinking, right? You don't overly go away from your general design approach, which is highly normalized, for scale until you actually run across scale problems.
Mm-hmm. That's very true. I mean, but one thing that's important, and I will say, like, one of the things with sort of J2E type of architecture and development that's used for like internal apps versus something that's e-commerce specific is performance is a big deal, right? So in e-commerce, you don't want a lot of lag. I mean, a lot of times companies will do like performance testing, like how many simultaneous users we have. Is it 100? Is it 10,000? Is it 10 million? No, that's important, right? On e-commerce, if you're getting slow response times from the pages and people get impatient, they're going to go someplace else with their shopping needs. They'll get annoyed very quickly. Versus an internal app where you're just sort of stuck using the app, so you can't go anywhere. If it's slow or it's fast, it is what it is. So
Yeah,
definitely e-commerce is very important, yeah, for performance.
Yeah. And we didn't have that on our list, but the fact that this is a customer-facing app is something that a number of our clients have run into in the past, that this was the first app that their Salesforce developers were working on that is actually facing the people that give them money. Most of their Salesforce development work was for internal purposes, and the internal users can just deal with that, right? If the UI is bad or if the UI is slow or whatever, but external customer is not going to use it. And if your buyer is not using your B2B commerce site, then you just wasted money creating B2B commerce site, and your salespeople have to get involved anyway. So yeah, so maybe at another time we can talk about, we might have something like this on the list, talk about the unique customer experience, your UX challenges that you're facing when you're producing a B2B commerce site for the first time, both as a Salesforce developer or architect, but also just as a company that does B2B sales. Often, I guess for a lot of our clients, they haven't actually had a website that customers can buy stuff from before. So they're thinking in B2B, but the website is suddenly screaming B2C because it kind of looks like Amazon. And that's this whole other set of worries, including performance, which is a big one that we always run into. We always have to worry about optimizing that, especially when you're doing your own customizations and adding code and adding queries and whatever.
Well, I think it makes it to kind of plug us a little bit here. I mean, that's the difference of like what I've seen with companies that historically have been, solid Salesforce consulting partners, right? But most of those Salesforce apps that they've worked in are internal. And usually, I mean, they're not dealing with millions of customers. Right? You're not having millions of salespeople that you're working with, and so it's the scale that you're dealing with is different. Internal expectations versus external expectations, and these partners think, oh, well, it's B2B commerce and Salesforce, so we can definitely do that. It's just Salesforce, but it's not. It's a whole I don't want to say, I mean, it's kind of like, I don't want to say it's another caliber, because it's not like those people, they have their strengths as well, but it's a completely different way of thinking. That's why it, you know, lends itself more to some enterprise development, or even some of those shops out there that are just e-commerce in general that maybe aren't even Salesforce specific, have a little bit of a edge here, right? But it's been difficult, right? That's why we're having this discussion about Salesforce coding versus B2B commerce coding. Is it's definitely a huge difference, and not only the technical terms of what you have to put together, but the expectations and the amount of testing, the types of testing, and the user experience. It's just it's this layer upon layer upon layer of what you would normally do in a normal standard Salesforce project, I think.
Yeah, and B2B commerce, of course, because it's built on Salesforce, on the Force2Come platform fully, is actually in this weird spot of being, you know, technically, architecturally a Salesforce application, but doing the work of a commerce site. Whereas B2C, the original like Demandware site, that is its own stack. It's a normal sort of web commerce, e-commerce stack, and it's not natively built on the Salesforce platform. Whereas so B2B is this weird spot, like who is the correct person to start working on it? Is it the Salesforce developer? Is it the front end, or is the e-commerce developer? Nothing else really has the intersection of those, really, other than specifically B2B commerce on Salesforce, aka xCloud Create.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Which is a little bit of a like odd position, but that's why we're talking about. That's why we have a whole series on the subject of Salesforce B2B commerce implementation and development. All right, so we're running out of time. I'd like to just very briefly recap what we went over, and then we can talk a little bit very briefly about some of the additional resources we're going to recommend if you want to understand this, dive deeper. Either if you're considering an implementation of B2B commerce, or if you're doing it and you're kind of thinking like, what have I gotten myself into? So just very quickly, the three big things that we, in our experience, find are the most difficult to get used to as a Salesforce developer, somebody who's been doing Apex, Visual Force, maybe Lightning components, are the front end is not the standard client-side stack in Salesforce. It's none of those technologies I just mentioned. It is Backbone with handlebars templates, wrapped by a special custom framework, an extension of the Backbone framework. And that framework is, you're not super likely to have encountered it at this point anyway, if you're one of the developers who's coming from JavaScript world, because modern JavaScript frameworks are, they handle separation of concerns a lot better than Backbone did originally. And that's why Lightning Web Components are the big thing now in front-end development. That's number one. Front-end development is not standard Salesforce client-side stack. Number two is you've got a solid server-side application layered architecture. So you've got a distinction between not just the presentation layer and the data layer, but you've also in between got a business logic layer and a persistence layer or a data access layer. And those are extendable. Again, there's dozens of ways you can extend those. Those are also designed for you or they're broken up, I should say, by domains that are specific to e-commerce. So you see the stacks, and then you'll see like, what are those business logic domains? What are the objects? There's a lot of them, and they may not be familiar unless you've done e-commerce before. Again, not necessarily Salesforce, but just e-commerce. The third one, related to the complexity of the data access layer and the number of bit logic domains there are, is that the data model in B2B commerce is extremely normalized. There's more than 100 custom objects. There's a lot of junction objects. There's very little either duplication of data or non-normalized data, except where performance considerations or limitations of the platform come in. So that means it's a very, very clean data model, but you're gonna have to think a lot about how to stitch together the data that you need if you're just coming into it from scratch. If you have general e-commerce experience, the data model might actually make more sense to you, again, than if you have just general Salesforce experience. So those are the three things. We're going to link to some relevant trailheads, although there's not a lot of B2B commerce specific trailheads. There's some advanced Apex trailheads we'll link to, and some JavaScript trailheads. Link to some of the documentation on Backbone and handlebars, the front end, the parts of the non-Salesforce client-side stack that B2B commerce uses. And Jonathan and I actually gave a talk for a slightly more, much more code-focused talk, but on some of the do's and don'ts for front-end development at Dreamforce last year, which we're also going to link to, which I think is available publicly on YouTube. That is, that's it for the recap. Jonathan, anything else?
Yeah, I just want to take a little bit of time just to thanks everyone for listening. We're doing these sessions to spread the knowledge here at 6th Street. We've been working on commerce on Salesforce, specifically on what's now the Salesforce B2B commerce platform for well, I mean, a little over 8 years now. I've actually been doing it for about 10 years, but when the team was formed, it's been about 8 years all, with everyone. And like we said before, it is a different platform. You can have, it's having this intersection of e-commerce and enterprise development, but on the Salesforce platform. So there aren't a lot of people that have sort of gained their footing in this space. We've been in it for a long time, so we thought right now is a good time to start sharing that knowledge. So thanks for your time today, for listening.
All right, yes, thank you very much. And just as a small teaser of some of the topics we're considering, and of course, we'll happy to take feedback on those topics. I mentioned already, we have a more advanced talk already on the front-end customization. We also have a talk planned, a conversation planned about pain points, about sad and happy things about B2B commerce development. That's going to go into some concrete areas, not just that are going to mystify you, but that are going to kind of constantly cause pain until you come up with ways around it. We also have a talk planned on UX, on again trying to come up with that mixture of B2B complexity and B2C Amazon-like user experience, something you're going to have to worry about, and something that I, not really having user experience design, have had to think about more since we started doing B2B commerce projects. And then we'll have a mix also of more business-focused topics. So we already had earlier in the series, we had a general introduction to what is B2B commerce. We're also planning to talk about something like a few things, like what in certain specific verticals make sense. Like we have a good deal of experience in manufacturing. There's some specific things in manufacturing that I think are worth going into. Well, there's something that's happening more commonly, especially in the age of COVID, which is that some companies that did not used to sell directly to consumers are now starting to do that. So there are business considerations as well as technical scaling considerations that we'll have to get into. We've also talked about on the level of, we're planning to talk about a level of business processes, the handoff when it comes to an order that's actually fulfilled. How do you get the order to go from B2B commerce to your ERP or fulfillment system downstream? How do you get data from that downstream system to come back to B2B commerce? That order management component is actually quite complex and highly varied from customer to customer, but there's some commerce specific things that we're happy to talk about at a process level coming up, if you guys are interested. Thanks very much. I guess that's it.
I don't know. I figured just pause at the end just to have a break, whatever.
Yes, good point.
That was good. I mean, right at the 3 o'clock, or sorry, 4 o'clock your time, Mark. Yeah. Right in time for happy hour.
Yes, it was a little longer than half an hour, but what was it, like 40 minutes maybe?
Oh yeah, I know it was a little longer. But I think that's, I mean, we're trying to shoot, right? It's not going to be exact. I don't know. I'm not too worried about being exact.
Yeah, no, I thought it was pretty efficient, and I felt like when I was like, oh, we got to move on, I think that it actually didn't feel like super forced. I think there were elements in N that connected to N+1 that made it feel like those selection of 3 surprising things actually was kind of coherent and understandable.
Yeah, I think it was good that we put an outline together. I mean, I liked the last talk too because it was very just organic, but this one I thought felt not like a webinar and not like the discussion. It was like somewhere in between almost.
Yeah, it felt more efficient and more focused. So yeah, maybe I think we should do an outline again next time too.
Okay.
Cool.
Sweet. Well, this thing has to like after I stop it, it has to like I don't know what it is, like saves and it converts and it uploads to the cloud. And so I think last time it took like an hour or 2. I'm not too sure. I'll send you the link when it's. I don't remember if you get the link or if I have to send it to you, but I'll send it to you whenever I get it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't remember if just the organizer gets it or if also the what do you call you, the panelist.
Right.
So
cool.
All right. Well, I'll let you go. Thanks. I thought it was good, especially considering we just like met yesterday and we did today, or met this morning too. Pretty good.
Yeah. No, thanks for making it happen,
these things out.
Yeah, I think we can do it, and it will take less prep time too as we get more used to it.
I think we have a lot of knowledge in this space. It's pretty easy for us. So kind of easy.
Yeah, and we took 30 to 40 minutes, and we didn't even like get into a lot of detail either. So I like that level. Maybe some of them. Yeah. but linking it for the resources, right? So
Mm-hmm.
cool.
All right. Well,
All right,
see
cool.
you in the happy hour if you're going.
I am. Yes. All right.